You, my guardian angel, take my soul of fire. In this game, we're double agents.
You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. I'm your host, Jay Dyer. Esoteric Hollywood is where I deconstruct the deeper messages, symbols, and predictive programming subtext that underlie modern film. In this show, we will be interviewing artists, experts, and numerous people in media fields. This will all be based on my years of research in comparative religion, propaganda, psychological warfare, secret societies, and espionage. Esoteric Hollywood decodes the biggest movies in an unparalleled way, from the classics of the silver screen to today's blockbusters. Learn to watch film with completely new eyes as we enter Esoteric Hollywood. Welcome to Esoteric Hollywood. I'm your host, Jay Dyer of jaysanalysis.com. Tonight I have a treat. We're going to be talking film still, but we're going to be talking about how film ties into all kinds of real-world espionage, geopolitics, philosophy, and economics. Tonight, my guest is Catherine Austin Fitts. How are you tonight?
Hey, Jay. Thank you for having me on.
Well, it's a pleasure. I was thrilled, enthralled by our conversations that we got to have at the Secret Space Program conference in Austin, Bastrop, and your talk really highlighted things that I've been looking into really the last 4 or so years. In my 20s, I spent a lot of time on philosophy and then getting into geopolitics. And then as I got into my 30s, I happened upon different books that, touched on the economic sphere, and that's really your area of expertise. But I don't want to sell you short because you have quite a bit, a vast breadth of knowledge in all of these areas and how they tie in. So I don't want to force you, to feel like you have to give the same interview a million times over, because I know what that's like.
Uh-huh.
But, I remember reading Michael Ruppert's book, and if I recall, there's an intro from you in that book, correct? Crossing the Rubicon, correct. Yes, and you mentioned the gentrification programs, and I had never thought about gentrification being something that would fit into global geopolitical economic scams. Could you tell us just a little bit about that, just to kind of kick it off?
Sure. Well, that's, I was trying to figure out how to make neighborhoods wonderful. I have something called the Popsicle Index. And the Popsicle Index, I was very interested in something called the Popsicle Index.
Okay.
The Popsicle Index is the percentage of people in a community who believe a child can leave their home, go to the nearest place to buy a popsicle, and come home alone safely.
Right.
And when I worked as Assistant Secretary of Housing in the first Bush administration. What I discovered was everybody was interested in making their stock go up, but there was no constituency for the Popsicle Index. And that's when I realized, the living equity in a neighborhood and the financial equity are at odds. You have this win-lose relationship between big corporations and making the world safe for children and plants and dogs and animals. So I thought, well, let's look at how we can re-engineer the financial system so that living equity and financial equity can give each other energy, so that, the Dow Jones and the Popsicle Index can go up together. And that made sense, because if you look at the value of real estate in a place, if you want to make the value of the real estate good. So I proceeded to I started to build when relational databases first came out. I said, aha, we can take all the data about government money, which is currently organized functionally. So it's organized transportation, housing, healthcare, military. It's not organized around your congressional district, so you can hold your congressman accountable. You don't get financial statements for your neighborhood, even though your biggest line item for many budgets is the taxes you pay. So I said, well, let's just dump everything into relational databases and start to look at money by community. And then I built a model of how we could finance small business with equity and, and create alignment. Basically create a financial model where the more money we're making, the more we're healing the environment, and the more we're helping the popsicle index go up.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought this was a great way for, you want to heal the environment? Well, let's make money healing the environment.
Yeah, right.
So I was basically trying to do this sort of re-engineering, but do it in a way that creates wealth I was working with a group of pension funds, and the idea was to get government money out of communities, get private money in a way that dramatically increased wealth for the pension funds because they were very worried about their retirement needs. Anyway, and so what I discovered, Jay, was my problem was organized crime. You had tremendous amounts of narcotics trafficking going on along with mortgage fraud. The mortgage fraud was basic, you'd sell drugs and then you'd launder the profits with a mortgage fraud, and there was literally a financial addiction within a neighborhood. And what I discovered, this is the way I say it, is, you couldn't get rid of Tony Soprano because Tony Soprano was financing James Bond, and every time you tried to shut down Tony Soprano, the black helicopters came down on these, soccer mom's head, and they're like, wait a minute, I'm just trying to stop narcotics dealing. Why is James Bond and black helicopters coming down on my head, Right. It doesn't make any sense until you really, what you discovered was you've got a highly leveraged financial model that's very, very centralized. And so you can't afford for one neighborhood to get out from under. Cause every time you saw a group of soccer moms, get the black helicopters coming down in their head, they're like, wait a minute. I'm not important enough. How can this possibly be happening to me? But in fact, it was the financing the black budget. And of course, one thing led to another. And I followed the string the whole way and finally realized if you look at the amount of money that was disappearing, this is a lot bigger than organized crime.
Right.
And I'll tell you the moment when I kind of crossed the Rubicon and said, okay, this is really happening. And there were many signals that I should have gotten it, but it was hard for me to believe it was really that bad. I was I think it was 2000 or early 2001, I went to see the chief of staff to the senator who runs the appropriation committee that oversees the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And at the time, vast amounts of money were going missing at HUD, or at least I thought it was vast until I saw the amounts of money going missing at the Department of Defense.
Right.
But you literally had money walking out the door of the federal government in trillions. This was astonishing. And I went to see the chief of staff, and essentially the senator who oversees the appropriation committee in the appropriation process is about the most powerful person because appropriations come out of the Congress. Anyway, so I went to see them. I was just on a bill collection because HUD owed my company some money, and I was trying to be discreet. It was not somebody I knew very well. And I said, what do you think? They said, HUD is being run as a criminal enterprise. They said to me first, what do you think is going on at HUD? I said, I don't know. What do you think is going on at HUD? And they looked me dead in the eye and said, HUD is being run as a criminal enterprise. Now, if you understand the HUD managerial and control structure, HUD is run by a matrix structure of Treasury, the Department of Justice, the New York Fed member banks, and HUD. And so if it's being run as a criminal enterprise, all those groups have to proactively run it as an organized, as a criminal enterprise. And so I looked at her and I said, I don't disagree. But it was that bad. And that's when it was funny because I spent many years traveling the world trying to warn investors about the extent of the mortgage fraud. And they literally couldn't fathom that what I was saying was possible.
It seems like the scope, it was something that people just couldn't wrap their heads around.
They couldn't, right.
And couldn't
wrap their heads around.
You would see the mainstream media at the time of, say, the bailout, and I don't want to get ahead of you. I know that you probably will explain that very well. But I remember the news would report that it's a few billion here, it's a few billion there. But then you would have other outlets like Bloomberg would report 23 trillion. You know what I mean?
So we had a great cartoon. I love cartoons and I love to use visual cartoons to, explain things. But we had a great one that I showed, you saw at the Secret Space Program, where a businessman is standing by a brick wall talking to another businessman. And he says, what do I care about a bunch of, hippie people running around Area 51 screaming about UFOs. Mm-hmm. And while he's saying this, he's got his attaché case and his tie looks very prosperous. A hand is coming through the brick wall, pulling his wallet out, and there's a little sound that says cha-ching. and that's the cartoon I used to say, the black budget finances one family and one person at a time. And the financial drain on every person is absolutely phenomenal. And it's, I think the hard part for me is the same that's hard for everybody, which is how could it have gotten this bad and I not know? And it's quite remarkable how they built it and organized it so that people really didn't kind of see it. But I think more and more people are seeing it. And frankly, the thing I love about what you do with the movies, every week we have a Let's Go to the Movie section on the Solari Report. And I think what you're doing is so great because I always say in America, fact is fiction and fiction is fact.
Yes.
And if you really look into the movies, they're telling you all of this. It's like a steam valve. We can all admit it's really going on by, in the movies, but then go into our daily life and proceed to, watch news programs, which are total fiction.
Oh yeah, big time. Yeah. I remember there were even interesting films that kind of would highlight what was going on in the financial sector. If you saw the film Margin Call by chance.
Fabulous.
Yeah, I remember watching that right around 2009, right after the 2008. I was thinking, man, this is like everything that I'm hearing in alternative media. Right? And that was right around the time that I read Crossing the Rubicon, and I saw your name mentioned there.
Yeah.
I think she's been on Alex Jones. I remember her. And so that, I came across Narco Dollars for Beginners, which is your sort of classic perennial essay on all that.
Yeah.
And it's just like, that is just mega eye opener. It's like, holy cow, this all makes sense. And what I liked about what was in that book, which you tied together in your work, is that, 9/11 was not, and I don't mean to go into this per se, but 9/11 wasn't just about terror and geopolitics. There was a lot of black budget stuff going on in the background. Right.
Well, that's why on the 9/11 was where I tried to, for years I tried to interest people in the black budget. And I'll never forget at one time I have a very lovely relative who's very interested in peace activism, and I kept saying, look, there's $4 trillion that's been stolen from the federal government.
Right.
And at one point she said to me, well, dear, that's your issue. My issue is peace. And I said, don't you understand, if somebody can steal $4 trillion from the federal government, they control everything. So your issue is my issue. It's one issue.
Amen. Right. All right. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. Tonight my guest is Catherine Austin Fitts, and the website is solari.com. That's SOLARI.com. We'll be back in just a few minutes for this network break. Stay tuned. This is Esoteric Hollywood. I'm Jay Dyer of jaysanalysis.com. Tonight we're talking to Catherine Austin Fitts, and we've been getting a little introduction here to black markets and how this ties into big events like 9/11, the 2008 bailout. And I interrupted there because all these data points started connecting in my head. And so take us back. So you were talking about how, here, I love your personal testimony to this, firsthand. Take us back to, you're seeing this firsthand and you're like, you can't believe the scope of this. And, you tried, I guess, through the proper channels to do what needed to be done. And it was, I'm guessing you didn't get very far.
Well, here's what happened. I came out of the Bush administration believing that you were going to have the people who I call the pro-centralization team get control of this technology and basically, centralize everything in a way that would be very, very bad for most people. And so I decided, okay, I have to do something. I'm a great believer you should always find a positive way. So, what I used to always hear from the spooky guys is you had to do all this stuff because that's what you needed to get the money to deal with whatever. Now, in a million years, I didn't understand what the black budget was, but to me, it was always like, okay, they need secret money, but, this is more than secret money. This is like the destruction of the whole economy. So I thought it was an emergency, and I came out of the Bush administration and said, I'm going to take this new technology and figure out a way we can make more, getting the popsicle index to go up, and basically realign, because part of the problem is you're doing huge environmental damage through the financial model. If you re-engineer the financial model, you put something where people can make money healing the environment and respecting the environment. So I was sure that we could so increase the learning metabolism in communities and do things that built place-based equity that you could really get, and the part of this was, there was way too much government money coming into communities, and it was really having a very detrimental effect. So I thought, we can go all private with this technology. And so I went to work and really thought if I built the model that everybody would say, oh, great, let's create.
Well, right, because government runs rationally, right? They run on reason, and it should be logical.
Oh, no, I wasn't worried. I wasn't working with government. I was working with pension funds.
Oh, okay.
So part of the biggest problem we had in the 90s was the pension funds were really worried about making their target investments. And so what I was saying is, look, let's re-engineer, total government investment in this way, produce huge capital gains on a rising popsicle index, and get the pension funds to get that so the pension funds will be on very solid ground. And instead what we did is we pumped and dumped the pension funds with debt fraud and all this other stuff, but left an economy that was much less productive. And I believe that's put the pension funds in worse shape than they could have been. But part of the thing, let me just say in defense of the pro-centralization team, they're trying to aggregate everything so that they can go up against China and compete on a global scale. So part of this is a really big issue of centralization versus decentralization, which brings us into how you're going to run the currency system, which pulls us back into space and why it's so important to the leadership to have control and dominance in space, because that's part of the global game. And a decision was made in the 90s to rebalance the global economy. So they're trying to suck as much capital out of our economy and shift it into the economies that are going to be growing faster, which they can do because they now have the satellites and the dominance from space.
Right.
Anyway, so that's I ran into the buzzsaw. I was just trying to get Tony Soprano out of everybody's neighborhood. And I pissed off James Bond very badly.
Well, who would you rather have, Michael Corleone or Don Corleone? I don't know. Well, actually, it's funny because Don, the Don didn't want to have the drugs, and then he meets with all the other Dons, and they take him out because I think you and I were talking about this because that's in that phase where they really wanted to start bringing the drugs in this. I really believe that the intelligence agencies squeezed the mafia out. They used them and then they squeezed them out. Right.
And it was really funny because I always tell people, look. When somebody comes to me and they say, I really want to learn how the economy works, I said, fine. First thing you do, you close the door, you get out whatever it is you like, popcorn, beer, whatever, and you watch Godfather 1, 2, 3, understanding that you are watching a training film on the U.S. economy as of 1979.
Exactly.
Then you call me, and we'll go from there.
Exactly.
And because I think The Godfather, the series, not only is it just a phenomenal cinematic experience, and very entertaining, but it's a fabulous description of the U.S. economy. And it sort of ends in the period when the mafia is getting squeezed out, which they did.
Exactly. And that's interesting too, that, that's the period where Michael Corleone is setting up tax-free foundations. I just saw today that, Mark Zuckerberg has donated 99% of his, supposed funds to this tax-exempt foundation, right?
He says he's going to. That there's a distance here between the cup and the lip, so I'm a skeptic. But what you're seeing with all these guys, because it's the same with many other people. They're not the principal. It's really not their money. They're playing for a syndicate. The syndicate thinks it's their money. Yeah. When I was running my investment bank in Washington, I'd meet with the CEO. We'd agree to something, and then he'd call me, or a week later, forget it, we don't want to do it. And what I realized was he's really not in control. He's a proprietary, and some guy at the agency said no, and that's it. It's kibosh. And
that reminds me of that scene in Margin Call where they think they've figured out this backdoor flash trade type scam thing. And then, as Jeremy Irons shows up and he just starts laughing at the boardroom, they're like, yeah, well, so what? Good job. See ya. And they're like, we figured out the scam.
Well, but here's the thing. If you look at the extent of the mortgage fraud, that was always the question in my mind. What was the end game? What was the plan?
Yeah.
Because it just kept growing and growing and growing, and it was so big that no one could fathom that it was really that bad. And I'll tell you a very interesting story. and this will give you a sense of the sort of mind control going. I was starting in about 2000 or 2001 because of the work I was doing on Enron. One of my theories was Enron was laundering all the money that was being stolen out of
You read my mind. I was about to ask you about Enron.
Yeah. Yeah. So I ran into Enron just because I was looking for the money, and all the guys who were involved in stealing the money were on the Enron board. I was like, well, this is very interesting because money's disappearing over here, and you have all these unexplained revenues and earnings over here, and it's the same people. So maybe there's a connection. Because you look at it, when you steal $4 trillion from the federal government, you can't launder that through a pizza restaurant. That's a lot of money. So anyway, so I'm following the money. That's why I'm looking, and it blew up, and then a radio station in the San Francisco area got me on, and I did the whole Enron thing, and it got huge national attention. And that's a whole nother story, but it kind of blew up because I think I had the 411 on them, and I had been litigating with the federal government, so I had just encyclopedic knowledge about what the Department of Justice could or could not do in civil and criminal cases related to fraud. You know, I knew more about procedures. Anyway, So I'm looking for the money. Wait a minute. What was I going to tell you about Enron? So I'm on this radio station from 2000 on, and I would sometimes I'd do regular shows, and then it would go for quite a period. But I was regularly on from 2000 to 2008, talking about all the mortgage fraud in many different aspects of the mortgage fraud. So this was, and they used to be on drive-by. They'd be on at 5 p.m. Just at the time everybody's driving home. Mm-hmm. So in 2008, when Fannie and Freddie went down, one of the largest, most prestigious money managers in San Francisco, a major national firm with a fabulous reputation, took $1 billion hit on Fannie Mae that they had just bought that spring. So imagine they bought $1 billion in the spring, and then it goes down, writes down worthless. They lose 100% in August, and they put this beautiful, gracious letter up on their website saying, we did very thorough due diligence. We had no idea. I said, wait a minute. The former Assistant Secretary of Housing was on drive-by radio, for 8 years telling you that it was this bad, but you didn't hear it?
Yeah.
It's like, it's just, every day I say it just keeps getting weirder, but you think they couldn't hear that. And when I tell you, Jay, I was not just the former Assistant Secretary of Housing. I was the former lead financial advisor for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I was a partner and member of the board of Dillon Read and Company. I was a member of all sorts of corporate boards. And, if you look at my resume, this was not someone who, if you listen to it and it sounds absurd, you look at my resume and you say, well, wait a minute, there's something here. I need to investigate.
Yeah, it's not this is not the car salesman down the road. Right? This is somebody who lives this, on that level, right?
This is what's interesting. For during that period, by 2008, there was not a trucker in this country who I hadn't met or talked to who didn't know the mortgage fraud was that bad. Mm. Okay, so you and I could have stopped at any truck stop in Tennessee, walked in, had a cup of coffee. They would have known. I'll tell you, this is a great story. This was Tennessee. It was about 2003. I was in Tennessee, and it was like a pilot, and there was a long line of truckers there. It was really backed up. So I was like about the 20th person in line, and there were about 40 guys in line ready to pay for their gas.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but we're going to have a break here in about 10 seconds. So the website is Solari.com, and we're talking to Catherine Austin Fitts on Esoteric Hollywood. So stay with us. To Esoteric Hollywood. Tonight we're talking to Catherine Austin Fitts, and we are talking economics, the real black budget, the real markets, right, and where this money really goes. And you were just telling us a story about how every trucker at that period, 2001 to 2008, would have known about what was really going on in this big scam. So go ahead and finish your story. I started to cut you off.
So, so I'm standing in the line. Now, I was trained on Wall Street. If you're standing in line and you got, 3 minutes to wait, you start making a call or reading something. You don't just stand there and waste the time.
Right.
So I went up to where the magazines were and I grabbed a National Enquirer to read it. And one of the truckers standing in front of me thought I was going to buy it. And he said, "Oh, lady, don't waste your money on that." I said, "I'm not going to buy it. I'm just going to read it." And I opened it up and there's a big headline that says, all the gold is missing from Fort Knox. And he says, "Well, that's true." He said, "Yep, the big boys have gotten together and stole all the money." And then all the truckers started looking at the article and talking with me. And so we got into this very detailed conversation about, how and why they were stealing all the money and how the truckers knew that, because they're carrying loads and they're watching the economy. They're seeing everything happen.
That was like Goldfinger, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they know. They're the one. Who do you think's shipping all the stuff down into the underground bases?
That's what I was
the
going to
truckers.
say. Yeah, there's got to be quite a bit of people. It's got like the Manhattan Project. You've got 2,000 people that are working on this project in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and eventually this it's got to get out. You've got 2,000 people knowing about it, and it can't be any different.
Right,
with
but they know.
Companies.
Right, but they know not to talk about it. They're careful. But it was anyway. So, do I believe that the guys who were, you probably had young guys out of business school assigned to do the due diligence. Somebody upstairs was assured it was okay, by the, the inside wink, and the young guy did due diligence, and they had not a clue. And that's how bad. I said at Secret Space Program, you need a bungee rope in your head to deal with this stuff. That's how many multiple worlds we have. Yeah. Because of the disinformation and the failure to provide good financial disclosure about what's going on in our world.
And it seems like a massive part of it really is the facade that we believe that the system is that it's operating one way, the way that we, were taught when we were in high school and then even in college. And that we don't realize that it's actually completely operating a different way. And so you see a lot of people talking about, the comprehensive annual financial reports, the CAFRs, and almost everybody. What's odd to me is that almost everybody tends to kind of suspect, generally, at the local level in their small town. We know about crooked cops, and we know about Mayor so and so got busted with black books, and there's double books or whatever. But then when we think about it on a big scale, we think, they're officials and that they're all going to be regulated. And from my experience, what you see as you follow this stuff is this sort of revolving door where people just go from the government to the private sector and then back to the government. And that allows for there to be, I'm thinking of, for example, of Rumsfeld. He would go to be on the board of different food corporations, and then there would be legislation passed dealing with different foods, MSG, or no, it was the sweetener,
aspartame.
Yeah, aspartame, that kind of a thing, right? And so what I'm wondering here is it really so bad? I think that it is, but is it really so bad that, like the regulators are just owned? Is that why?
Well, it's a very good question, and the truth is complex. But to give you an I in the 90s, I was engaged in very serious litigation with the federal government. Mm-hmm. And at one point, my attorneys asked me to dictate a complete record of my experience in the Bush administration, which I did except for a couple of the most sensitive, dicey stories. And we put it together in 6 90-minute cassettes. And when I tell you, I thought it was one of the most boring things, but they wanted it, so I did it, blah, 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 blah. And so one of the guys who was working for me said, "Do you mind if I listen to it?" And I said, "Oh, why would you want to listen to that?" I said, "Sure." He came back. He said, "That is the most fascinating thing I've ever heard." Well, it started, and at some point we had made hundreds of copies because everybody wanted to listen to it. It's before West Wing or before House of Cards, and he came. One of the original guy who listened to it, he came to me and he said, "I want to really apologize to you because I always believed that somewhere in there were like adults who were really running the country."
Yeah.
And now I realize it's like It's like House of Cards.
Okay.
I mean, if you've seen Kevin Spacey in House of Cards, it's like House of Cards. And it's like all these guys. I don't know if you've ever seen the Bushkaji, which is a form of Afghani polo where they play for the body of a dead lamb and everybody just, everybody's on horses with whips, and the rules are there are no rules. You try and whip the guy who's got the lamb until he's in so much pain he drops the lamb. And that's what, when I watched House of Cards, I said, great, now people know what it's like. So it was very interesting. I was later told that the reason, in fact, that they wanted these tapes was they had tried several times to falsely frame us. We caught them.
Wow.
It didn't work. And so what they figured is, okay, we can't frame her on anything, and that she's done as the financial advisor to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We'll go back into the Bush administration because we control the executive branch, so we'll frame her on something she did then. And they had no idea, apparently, when they got the tapes, what the true story. They never look under the rug. Right. James Bond never looks under the rug of what Tony Soprano and the mess he's making. And apparently, it was interesting because those tapes told the true story on a couple of people, both the secretary and the general counsel. And those were people who were rising the Republican hierarchy. As soon as those tapes went over, I'm assuming they ended up at the agency. Those two people disappeared from the public spotlight and were never seen again. That was the end of their political, they never showed up as appointees in the second Bush administration. Anyway, so I think my guess is that group of tapes sort of shocked a lot of people when they finally had to look under the carpet and see what was going on. Anyway, so what happens in the trenches in these different agencies is very complex and messy because you have a layer of civil service who are operating under written instructions, and then you have a layer of attorneys who behind attorney-client privilege are trying to do funny business. Then you have a group of defense contractors and IT contractors who are really running the systems, and a lot of the stuff is rigged through the systems so that the civil service doesn't see it, or at least doesn't have to take responsibility. Yeah. And then you have the political appointees who are turning over so fast they have not a clue what's really going on.
Now, would these things like these algorithmic scams or flash trades, backdoor technology, would that be part of the way that this stuff might be done covertly? So that you would only have, a couple people that actually know what's going on, and then everyone else is kind of just going along because they don't know about the sophistication.
Here's the thing. The flash trades occur on private exchanges, so that those are not governmental exchanges. Here's the important thing to understand when it comes to the federal government. The federal government's banker is the New York Fed, which means the New York Fed member banks control the depository servicing and banking functions. So when somebody says, we want you to regulate the banks, well, the banks control your bank accounts. They control your money. You're totally dependent on them operationally for thousands of different things. And they're controlling the payment systems with all the other countries and everything else. They're the platform on which you stand. They control you. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
So,
But the pretense is supposed to be that, these different agencies regulate the possible scamming that, that could go on in these private banks. But as I understand that a lot of this can be done outside the purview of those regulations because it's impossible to track these kinds of things.
It's not impossible to track these kind of things.
Okay.
Everything that's digital leaves a record.
Right.
I'll give you a perfect example. I did a series of 7 shows with this radio station called Enron Anatomy of a Cover-Up, and I went through the different, in a financial fraud, the first things you do to assert control of the records and then to assert control of the facts, of what happened and create an evidentiary pathway. Anyway, but for example, after the Enron thing broke, and they were doing all sorts of stuff about you have 700 subsidiaries in the Cayman Islands and money laundering and this. And finally, the head of the financial system in the Cayman Islands, I guess it was the equivalent of Secretary of Treasury, someone like that, came out and said, the Cayman Islands would be delighted to cooperate with the Department of Justice on any investigation, but as of yet, they have not had a request. There was no, I mean, if you went down and there was absolutely no effort to assert control of the records. And, I would get on these shows and I would walk down the different records you need and how they had not asserted control on all of them. And it was interesting. Right after we did the big Washington show, we did a roll-up that ran on all the stations nationwide and, including the lead station in Washington. It was the next week they indicted Arthur Anderson. And to this day, I'm wondering if they did that to make sure that those records got destroyed.
Okay.
So yeah. So it's, What
the,
you'll see
the trail
is,
has to be gotten rid of, basically. We follow the money and then you just get rid of the footprint.
Right. There is for example, in the $4 trillion that went missing from the federal government, there's a trail. And in fact, one of the big questions on 9/11 was a lot of that trail blown up or destroyed or made much harder to get. Because the trail was not just on the banks. The trail was on the securities, the federal security, Treasury securities.
Right.
One of the things to understand is not only are the New York Fed member banks the depository for the U.S. government, but they manage on behalf directly of the Secretary of the Treasury. It doesn't go through the civil service, the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which I call the mother of all slush funds. And I believe all the derivative books at the New York Fed member banks are really positions of the U.S. government or as agent for the U.S. government. Oh. And so, the last thing you're going to do is attack a big bank that's managing a huge derivative position for you.
All right. Well, we're talking finance and black markets on Esoteric Hollywood with Catherine Austin Fitts from Solari.com. Stay tuned. Listening to Esoteric Hollywood. This is Jay Dyer of jaysanalysis.com. Listen, if you're looking for organic supplements, check out j.talknetwork.com. Mike Adams has his own lab by which he tests all those products. And that's really the best way, I think, to ensure that you're not getting anything GMO, anything toxic or modified in some weird, perverse way. So be sure to check out j.talknetwork.com. We're talking to Catherine Austin Fitts of Solari.com, and we're getting really deep into the black books and financial scams. And you were just telling us about how that it might actually, in my notes, my next question was the derivatives bubbles and scams. And I wanted to get your take on how this ties into what we're talking about. So go ahead.
Well, it's in one sense it's hard to know because the amount of analytics we have available publicly on the derivatives is not what we wish it to be. But the big book of derivatives are interest rate swaps. And so we've seen, Jay, for the last 30 plus years, we've been in what's called a long-term bull market for bonds because interest rates on bonds have been going down, 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 down. And the price of bonds, that is support to the price of bonds that are generally going up, up, up. And as that happened, we've turned into what I call planet debt. We've been issuing more paper and more paper and more paper. And part of what helped engineer those rates down were interest rate swaps and being able to hedge. And I suspect have governments step in there and use interest rate swaps to push things down.
Now, is this why the government regulates and wants them low? Is that the reason? Is it because it makes it easier for that to happen?
What it does is it lowers the cost of capital to people who have access to that low interest rate money. So, and part of the reason we have such huge inequality is because we're watching government being used to engineer a very big spread between what you and I can borrow at and what the federal government and big companies can borrow at. So, so student loans are going out there at 6 to 8%, but a bank can go borrow at 0.01%, during the bailout. Yeah. So, this is, from a financial standpoint, it's a very unproductive system because it basically sends, free money to everybody who's got a big gun and can kill with impunity. And then everybody else, no matter how productive they are, gets, very high cost of capital. So cost of capital is related to who has the power, not who's productive. And it's very, very destructive of the economy.
And if you're a mega bank, if you're a mega bank, you can say that we need that rate, or the whole economy is going to collapse. Right? We're too big to fail. And then at the same time, they will tell everyone that we need to engineer austerity. So what's your take on austerity? Because when I read books, say, and I'm not necessarily arguing for leftism or liberalism or anything like that, but I try to look at both sides of the spectrum, Austrian economics as well as critics of Austrian economics. So if I read people like Naomi Klein and Shock Doctrine, or if I read John Perkins, Economic Hitman and Hoodwinked, what I see there is this being a tool to really not just domestically run these operations from an economic standpoint, but also geopolitically to basically attack countries, through economic warfare, sanctions, and then the IMF comes in and offers this big, loan, which then puts everybody in the nation's capital up as, basically what's going to pay this big IMF loan. What's your take on all that kind of stuff? Is that because it seems to fit into this?
Right.
It's a big global scam, really.
So you're using a very low cost of capital that you can engineer off the federal credit mechanism in combination with covert operations to basically entrap and squeeze and liquidate. And it's happening globally, and it's happening on a one-on-one level. I mean, that's the amazing thing about smartphones. Smartphones combined with relational databases and artificial intelligence has created a situation where we can run an entrapment game on one person, one family, bottom up, into the whole planet. So it's quite remarkable, but it is a highly centralized model, and it is basically harvesting everyone from an individual to a national level. Right. Yeah.
Now,
I use one of my nicknames is the tapeworm.
Now,
did you ever hear that? I just have to explain one thing.
Sure. I
started to call the system the tapeworm, or, the pro-centralization team I used to call the tapeworm. And the reason why was I had a healthcare practitioner once explain to me that the way a tapeworm grows is it injects in you a chemical that makes you crave what's good for the tapeworm and bad for you. And in fact, if you get down to the individual, family, community level, the tapeworm is being helped and facilitated by the people who are being harvested by it. It's quite remarkable. And you're right. And the injection is very much the media. So the media is injecting a chemical that makes people crave what's good for the tapeworm and bad for them, but they facilitate their own demise.
Is there an element to which they also promote rabid consumerism, such that we feel that we need to live beyond our means? Because I'll hear that a lot of times from, say, for example, people from the Austrian economic crowd. They'll say, oh, well, we've got to pay the bankers. We've got to go into austerity because we've lived beyond our means. And if you look at things like Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac, these were situations where the government stepped in and tried to, basically capitalize on everybody from this kind of socialist perspective to make housing supposedly affordable and cheap. And that's not at all what happened. It was basically a scam, as I understand. So,
well, here's what's happening. If you look at how people are spending their time and money, they are spending their time and money in ways that significantly reduce both their living equity and their financial equity. So I'll give you an example. someone sent me the grocery sales for all grocery stores in the United States ending June 30, 2015. We spent $2.2 billion on fresh fruit and vegetables and $10.5 billion on carbonated drinks. Now, what I have to tell you is, it's very interesting. I was on Coast to Coast and I used that statistic, and George Norrie said, "Oh my God, it's hopeless." Now, if you just take the money that we spend on hard narcotics, on the lottery, on buying or watching TVs, or on, food, which is clearly, let's just say sugar.
Not food, right?
Okay. Right. We have enough time and money to completely reinvent and reinvigorate the whole economy. And that's not the tapeworm doing that. That's us doing that.
Right.
So what you've seen is a general debasement, and some of this is triggered by the financial system, because if my prices are going to go up 5% a year, but I'm getting 0% on my bank deposits, of course I'm going to buy it this year. Why wouldn't I? It's just going to go up 5% and I'm not going to get any return on my savings. So it's the smart thing to do to get that asset into my hot little hands this year. Mm-hmm. So we're all overspending because it's the smart economic choice, as long as your expenses are inflating and your yields. I mean, if you look at household budgets, families, the single biggest cause of families' sort of financial pain is that they're paying taxes to an organization that is using those taxes to do things that harm them. The second biggest problem is that they are spending money on things which are harmful to them and their health. Mm-hmm. But the third biggest thing is they're putting money in banks and other financial institutions, and whereas in 1990 they were getting 6 to 8% yield on their money, risk-free, today they're getting 0. And after 25 years of falling interest rates, the savers, who are the productive people, are getting slammed.
So what the way that we would traditionally think that it's wise to save your money is kind of been re-engineered to where that's it's no longer the case, really. And I think it is wise to save your money, but if you look at the strategies that succeed in this kind of environment, so if you just said to me, look, I want to do whatever it is that optimizes my building of living equity and financial equity in this environment, give me a list, I'm going to do that. Most people are not doing what they can to protect. Some are. There are a lot of pretty smart people, and you can really see a separation going on in the United States population, with the people who are acting smart in this environment are making it, and everybody else is sort of going down. Well, one thing I like about your analysis is that it tends to be sober. It's not fear-based. You're not constantly talking about how the crash is coming tomorrow. But what you have said that I thought was very profound was that you talked about, if we look at the bailout, this was, you said, a system that was overwhelmed. And you said that it was specifically engineered. So in your mind, it wasn't. Oh, yeah. It wasn't accidental. It's not a natural cycle of economic, cycle. It's not the cycles that we go through, boom bust cycles. That this is actually what happened.
No, $40 trillion was intentionally pulled out. It was engineered top down. You can't pull that kind of money without it being engineered top down. They're totally on top of. These people are very competent. They know what they're doing. I'm not saying. The process is always smooth because there's a lot of fighting and competition and everything else, so it's very organic. But they basically said, let's suck as much money out of the developed world as possible. Let's reinvest it in a variety of different places, including the emerging markets and some in space. So let's get it at, because we can either pay for all these folks in nursing homes, or we can go to Mars. So let's roll them and go to Mars.
Interesting. So now, we've got a break coming up here, but when we come back, I'd like to get a little bit more into the black markets and the dark stuff, because you're so insightful on that. And it's not often that we have this kind of an insight. So when we come back, that's what we'll talk about. The website is Solari.com, and you offer subscription, correct, to your publication?
Yeah, I published something called the Solari Report. What happened was my I'm an investment advisor, and my clients all kept asking me the same questions every week. So
you decided to.
I finally said, I can't answer this, this many times because I was saying the same thing over and over again.
All right.
So I said, I'll just batch all the questions and publish the Solari report.
Listening to Esoteric Hollywood. I'm Jay Dyer of jaysanalysis.com. If you want to learn philosophy, go to jaysanalysis.com and you can actually learn it apart from the state education system. I offer philosophy lectures for $4.95 a month, and presently we're working our way through the Dialogues and Republic of Plato. So definitely check that out at jaysanalysis.com. We're talking to Catherine Austin Fitts of Solari.com, and we were just saying she puts out the Solari report, which is her analysis of what's going down in financial markets and geopolitically, as well as culture too. And I heard you on a recent interview, and you were talking about China, and that what you just said in the last segment made me think of that because, as I read history, I'm a big history buff of the 20th century especially, it looks to me like what we saw was kind of a plan to deindustrialize the West. And then out of World War II, we get this Bretton Woods system and the Bank for International Settlements. And so that kind of codifies, it congeals this global system that we're all in, and with the dollar as the world reserve currency. And then we hear some analysts talk about moving from an SDR, special drawing rights, which is this IMF plan, to kind of put it into a big basket. And so what is the relationship of China to this? Because as I see, it looks like the elites in the West, the Rockefellers, people like this, they wanted, to deindustrialize the West and build up China.
Well, I'm not sure they decided to deindustrialize the West. I think they decided to shift tremendous manufacturing to Asia for a period. If you look at what they're doing now that they've busted the unions, it looks like they're rebuilding industrialization with robotics here.
Wow.
And, essentially what they did is they did two things. They moved the industrial manufacturing there that moved the pollution to Asia, and then they busted the unions here. And now that they've got that done, they're bringing back very clean manufacturing, all with very automated. So, if anything, it looks like they may be reindustrializing, and part of it may be there's a lot of tension now between the United States and Asia, and the supply line issues are getting more sensitive. I think, one of the questions is, once we got the satellites up and had the ability to do enforcement globally with what I suspect are probably space weapons, but certainly tracking and doing surveillance with satellites, you saw us globalize the money. And that's because the reality is, if you've got a lot of capital in the West and it's at a low yield because you're not growing as fast, if you move it to the developing world, then you get a much better return. So whatever, they made a decision to rebalance the economy. They made huge bets on China.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to a certain extent it's turning out differently than they thought. But my guess is, if you look at the committee that runs the planet, so I'll use my nickname, Mr. Global, I think Mr. Global thought the Chinese, given their extraordinary, they're really a remarkable people in terms of their learning metabolism and their productivity. I just think Mr. Global thinks that they have a better chance of accomplishing what they want to do, including going into the space in a big way, if the Chinese, if you have, 1.4 billion people going to engineering school and helping. So I think one was a decision because the technology would permit it to rebalance the global economy, but the other was to get the Chinese engaged in building out some of the global infrastructure, including the infrastructure to go into space.
So you have a vast human resources, so to speak, workforce there, potentiality that could chip in, I guess is what you're saying.
Right, and it's not just the Chinese, it's the Indians, because the Indians, if you look at the sort of engineering and technology talent and scientific resources that you can build out in those two populations, it's quite remarkable. So I think they wanted to get, they wanted to get the Asian and the subcontinent geared up into doing whatever it is they're out to accomplish.
Well, I wonder, from what I look at, what I research, it looks like things like sustainability, Agenda 21, the plans of the Club of Rome, and what we see the UN try to do with, say, cities like Austin, that they call them, test cities or whatever, experimental cities for these kinds of plans. This seems to tie into things like gentrification, where the intention seems to be to shift the cities over into sort of a global plan of how a city should be, right? So it's not going to be organically growing up. It's going to be a model that all the cities are going to follow. And when we look at people like Jenny Romedy of IBM, she gives lectures where she says, you're actually going to have smart cities, and these smart cities are going to track and trace everything that you do. And places like Rio and Singapore are going to be but I see that fitting into the model of the UN as well. So it's not,
right.
It's not a private versus civil thing. They're actually sort of linked at the hip, and it's IBM's going to work with the city and local governments to set these things up.
Well, let me bring up a couple of historical points, because I agree with you totally. I mean, you're herding the populations into the cities and trying to create, now there are 3,100 counties in America, 156 now have 50% of the population. Mm. So you already have achieved a fairly high concentration. But if you go back through history, I just finished reading, there's a review up on the site, history of the American slave trade called The Half That's Never Been Told. And one of the things they point out was that the city of London got burnt a couple times by the Southern banks, because when revenues would go down, they'd just take the slaves and move them west and sell them for cash, keep the proceeds, and stiff the banks. And the city got burned a couple times. And one of the things I sort of ask as a question is, did the Brits cancel the slave trade because they kept getting burnt because there was no perfect way to perfect the collateral? And the problem with digital technology and the global spraying is now there is a way to perfect the collateral. And that gives one great pause, because if you look at the history, let's jump to the Holocaust. As you well know, it was IBM that created the database infrastructure that facilitated and made the Holocaust possible, and continued to supply the Nazis all throughout the war. Edwin Black did a great book on the subject. Mm-hmm. It is now IBM who's on the lead, both on the census for the U.S. government, and on making the software for the smart meters.
Yes, as well as Watson and right.
Right. So what they're doing is they're building an infrastructure, and the two companies I think to really watch are AT&T and IBM. They're building an infrastructure to create, a collateral system that will collateralize essentially human ownership or slavery.
Yes.
And the danger of this is, if you look between the smartphones and the smart meter, and if it involves in perfecting slave collateral, it's called smart.
Yeah,
but
right. What does David
Petraeus
say? We're going to spy on you through the dishwasher. Yeah.
Right. So if you look at how that system works, it's a harvesting system, and what they're doing is they're using their access and this sort of no privacy to harvest, manipulate, and control you, particularly when you get into what's coming through in terms of entrainment technology. So whether they're basically using that to skim off all your living and financial equity and put it in their pocket.
Yeah, when I worked at AT&T for a year, and I was kind of surprised actually with what they taught us, even in sales, was, we had to learn all this kind of stuff, and we were learning about how we are transitioning into the cashless society. At that time, it was actually called ISIS. That was the program. I'm not kidding. That was 2 years ago. That was the AT&T cashless, you could pay with your cell phone program. Was called ISIS. We had to take all kinds of tests on it and stuff. We also went to the regional data center, so I've actually stood over the servers at the AT&T complex that collect everyone's information and data and traffic for the whole, I think, tri-state area is what they said. But yeah, this massive complex of so meanwhile, that was at the time that Snowden was all in the news, and so we're being told, oh, Snowden's leaking this information about what the NSA is doing, and I'm sitting here thinking, well, the real NSA is AT&T because I'm standing on top of the servers that are collecting everything.
It looks to me like the private guys are using Snowden to
exactly,
assert real control.
That's what I've argued. Yeah. Now,
yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and IBM is interesting too because I had a friend who worked for them a while back, and they have a sort of a joint complex in Kentucky where it's IBM and Xerox. And what Xerox was busy doing at that time, and probably still, because I imagine this is a big feat, similar in a way, I guess, to what Google was doing with books. So we're taking everyone's old medical records and digitizing everything. And people were wondering, like, well, why are you digitizing everyone's old medical records? And when you listen to Jenny Romedy give her lectures about Rio and Singapore and smart cities, she tells you, she says, because everything will be in the central grid, and this will be for pre-crime. And she explicitly says in that talk that the pre-crime will know everything about you ahead of time, and even be able to tell, when you're going to get sick, when you're going to do this or that. And so it's really just amazing. It's literally out of all these sci-fi, stories that we've heard.
There was a great movie that I keep trying to find about a murder. It's a murder mystery, and a cop's trying to solve a series of killings. And what he figures out is they're being killed because they need the organs. So they're identifying people through the healthcare records and the databases, and then having them sort of arbitrarily killed and come into the the hospital where they need the organ. And somehow he figures it out. And I keep trying to find the movie because I want to use it on Let's Go to the Movies, and it's like it's disappeared.
Is it a newer one?
No, it's I think it's 90s.
Okay.
I think it's 80s or 90s. Anyway, but as soon as Obamacare started being debated, it was like I can't find it. Yeah.
So do you think the organ trade fits into that?
I think you're crazy to let your healthcare records go into the database.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing: I worked in the federal government, and I was running the mutual mortgage insurance. I was running the mortgage insurance funds of the FHA, and I was required by statute to take certain. I had certain legal responsibilities, and I would go to the defense contractor who ran the information and payment systems and try and get the data I needed to run my operation, and they would refuse to give it to me, and there was nothing I could do. And what I figured out is, okay,
well,
UC21.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back. You're listening to Esoteric. To Esoteric Hollywood. Tonight, my guest is Catherine Austin Fitts. Go ahead and finish your thought there. I had to cut you off for the break.
Oh, so what I realized was, there were 21, it's called the 21 Covered Agency, the federal government, but in fact there were a few contractors, and they were all putting it into one database. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And they were using that database. I have an article called The Data Beast where I sort of describe this. And they were doing, just like I knew to do Community Wizard in the 90s so that we could map out all the money. They were sucking everything into one thing that were being used very dynamically. And I realized at one point when Facebook first came out, I said, oh, I know what this is. They finally realized it was too much money. They're paying too much for data servicing. Let's come up with a way that everybody will do their own data servicing and keep their own file updated.
Right.
So this is very clever. So,
well, yeah, that's what have you ever heard of the Schwitzgebel machine?
No.
This is an invention of Dr. Schwitzgebel from, I believe, the 60s or 70s, and it was this device that you would wear on you, and it was for inmates. And what would happen was the inmates would thereby be able to transmit not just their location, but also things like heart rate and where they were, back to a central location, and it was not just for security, it was also done as an experiment to see if people, how they would operate and police themselves if they knew that they were, watched and tracked and traced at all times. And so I've actually wondered if that wasn't partly what went into the idea of everybody having, eye watches and these things that would, basically transmit all of your health data back to this central base or whatever, right? So that it could all be stored. I mean, because it's amazingly parallel to the Schwitzgebel machine that was used by prisoners or for prisoners.
Right. Well, if I'm on the phone and I talk about, I never get headaches, but if I say I have a headache, within 5 minutes I've got emails coming in on my junk mail, marketing headache solutions.
It's amazing. Now, I've noticed here, while we're getting into film and sci-fi land here, I noticed that you and John Rappaport did talk about Ray Kurzweil and Transcendent Man. There's a lot of crazy stuff in that documentary. What it just blows me away, though, is how much of it we've seen in science fiction and in Hollywood. So tell us as we...
Well, these guys are certifiably nuts. It's like, Kurzweil must have a piece missing. In fact, I met him once. I just think he has a piece missing. It's like he's
Really?
completely clueless about how the planet works. So something that means, we're going to be converted to a slave society, he thinks it's great because we're all going to be full of, this is going to empower. Are you nuts? It's like the guy is just missing a piece. He has no discernment or something.
Academic types tend to live in an ideal realm, and then it's very much divorced from how things really go, and that's tends to be the danger of idealistic systems historically. They lead to quite a bit of bloodshed because something like state Marxism, right, where it's the leaders mad at everybody because they're not conforming to the
right. There's a great book by Tim Wu, the guy who ran for lieutenant governor in New York. He's a professor at Columbia, called The Master Switch. Mm-hmm. And it's about how a new technology comes out in terms of information technology. And you go through a period of blossoming and renaissance where people try things and it's great and everybody thinks, oh, this is going to make the world much better. Mm-hmm. And then, whoop, suddenly it consolidates and all it's done is created more central control. Mm-hmm. And he takes you through, from before Edison through where we are now, and he shows you how it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. But each time the new development comes out, everybody thinks, I remember when computers came out, I thought, this is fantastic because people can learn at their own speed. They can learn whatever they want. It's just going to be wonderful. It's going to be so empowering. And I remember I had a wonderful stepmother she was looking at me like, you are the stupidest woman on the planet. You have not a clue, honey. It just means they're all going to be watching us, She knew. She was.
Right.
Yeah. She knew.
You look back to these old planners like Bertrand Russell and Aldous Huxley, and they write in their books that you're going to have a card and it's going to be digital, or they didn't use the word digital, but it would be electronic banking, and you'll get a series of credits, and then if you don't use up your credits at the end of the week, they'll start over. This is what Bertrand Russell's saying, and he's saying, we'll give you an impetus for getting the state funded credit card here. If you get sterilized, you'll get extra credits and they'll roll over. Right? This is literally the.
Well, we're starting to see. Yeah, the lockdown's getting accelerating. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal this week saying that if you hadn't paid your taxes, you were going to lose your passport. Yeah. And then one today saying an Illinois hospital refused to give services to anybody who hadn't had a full slate of vaccinations. So here we go.
Wow. Well, let's talk about some movies. Yeah. So now we've mentioned Margin Call. We've mentioned the Godfather. Trilogy. Tell us some other movies that you really think stand out for highlighting what's really going on.
My favorite, it's really interesting. John Rappaport and I did a Let's Go to the Movies where we each chose 5 movies and basically introduced the 5 most important movies for understanding reality. And then we came back again and did it with documentaries. And we decided we would surprise each other. So we would not tell each other what the movies were that we were chosen. Right. And there was only one movie that we both chose, and that was They Live.
Interesting.
Right, it was pretty interesting. And we talked about it at the Secret Space Program because I guess you asked somebody that question,
But yeah, people are asking,
or you got asked that.
why haven't you talked
Daniel
about this
asked.
movie? Why did you talk about this movie?
Well, you know why? Because I use it so much on the Solir report. That's that's why you got asked, and there were a lot of there were a lot of subscribers and other people.
All right, now, so let's say I'm a skeptic. I'm a skeptic. And I say, come on, this goofy John Carpenter movie, how in the world do you think this is telling us about reality?
I'll tell you why, because it's telling you about entrainment. It's telling you about entrainment, subliminal programming, and mind control. And the entrainment, subliminal programming, and mind control is so much more powerful and present than anybody can imagine.
Now, you say entrainment.
It has so
What do you mean entrainment?
Entrainment, okay, so I'm not going to be able to explain this because I'm not a scientist, and I've had scientists explain it to me many times, and it's in one head, out the other. I did a Solari report that I try and get every subscriber to read, because it's an interview with Adam Trombley, who's a scientist that I work with occasionally, on entrainment technology and how it works. And basically, my understanding is entrainment is and it's basically electronics that makes you resonate with something. It sort of opens you up, makes you feel good. It makes you feel pleasurable. And then you're susceptible, and then there's subliminal programming that, and you're now susceptible because of the entrainment.
Oh, wow.
But it's sort of a 1-2 punch. And the first time I've experienced it in several contexts, but the first time I ever experienced it in a speech context, it felt exactly like what it feels like to be with a whale. It felt like a synthetic junk version of being with the whales. It's the only way I can describe it. Have you ever swum with whales?
Is that what you said? Oh,
Have you ever swum with whales?
No, but I watched Star Trek 4.
Well, here's the thing.
Where they wanted to say that. I'm kidding.
The most fabulous feeling I've ever felt was being with the whales.
Really?
It's the most, it's a very, very powerful experience. It just literally is a life-changing experience.
Wow.
To be around them. They have such a beautiful, one, they're clearly, from just my limited experience, they're clearly unbelievably intelligent.
Right.
And spiritually so far beyond us. It's remarkable to be with them. And you feel fantastic, other than you're like in shock that this could happen. Who knew? And it was not that long afterwards that I was walking into a ballroom and at a conference, and there were a series of speeches, including the former head of the CIA, and they were using entrainment technology, and I was like, oh my God. And it felt like a big synthetic version of what it's like to be with the whales.
Interesting. Now, I've seen some older sort of public Army War College PSYOPs type documents and essays, white papers, and they will talk about this kind of stuff, or at least what it seems to be this kind of stuff, of something like the mind has no firewall, where you'll have something like on a screen, and then within the electronic signal of the screen. Now, are you talking about something more sophisticated than that actually kind of like flips on receptors in the mind?
Something, you got to go listen to the Solari report, because Adam's a scientist. He can explain to you how this stuff works. I'm completely not competent to do that.
Does it try to flip the receptors that are associated with that kind of a pleasurable experience, though? Is that kind of what it is?
I have no idea. I can tell you the times I've experienced what it felt like, or I can send you to read the transcript with Adam. But and I've had Adam and other scientists explain to me the details of how it works, and I've reviewed a whole bunch of books on the Solari report that get into this technology and how it works. But for the life of me, Jay, I just don't understand it. Part of it is, it's so disgusting. I don't even want to.
That is pretty
think
wild.
about.
Yeah, I mean. Well, and that's kind of what's going on in They Live, though. I mean, that it really is. It's like they're beaming, this
Right.
signal to everybody, and you don't see it until you put the glass. Esoteric Hollywood. Tonight, my guest is Catherine Austin Fitts of Solari.com. Finish your thought there. I keep having to cut you off. Go ahead.
So they were on either one side of the balance sheet, or they were at a macro or micro, but think of it as 4 quadrants between the two sides of the balance sheet, macro and micro, and everybody was sort of in one quadrant. And some of the guys I worked with used to come to my website and say, "You're all over the map." I said, "No, I'm not. I'm just integrated." But everybody had their own, it was sort of multiple personality disorder, and everybody was in their own little foxhole, and nobody was looking at the whole thing as a living ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And so finally, when I met Daniel List, he did an interview for Mac Tribe, and he was trying to understand, well, what are you about? What are you about? What are you about? And finally he came back to me and he said, "Oh, I see. You're trying to give people a pair of sunglasses." Mm-hmm. Because, there was something about that movie and the sunglasses that made it, because I'm not trying to teach people about money. I just want them to be able to protect themselves. So I need them to have a pair of sunglasses. That's it.
Right.
So it was and that's kind of, it does a great job of explaining the fact that you need a pair of sunglasses, and some people have sunglasses and some people don't, and you need to understand it's very different protocols, talking with them.
Interesting. Tell us another film that you thought really stands out.
Well, it's funny. I was just going to look at the list. Well, of course, The Godfather is one that I always use. So let me I'm going to see what else. Well, I know one of them was Enemy of the State. So it was
great.
They Live, Enemy of the State, and then I used Battlestar Galactica, and the TV series, not the original movie. And then Syriana and The Gladiator were my picks. And then John had The Secret of Nikola Tesla. He cheated and did some documentary-like things. His Girl Friday, Citizen Kane, and The Fountainhead.
Oh, wow.
So
quite a list there. So let's talk. Let's rewind here. So you picked. You mean the newer series of Battlestar Galactica, right?
Yeah, the newer series. I picked They Live, the newer series of Battlestar Galactica, They Live, Syriana, and The Gladiator.
Now tell us what about I think I know where you're going to go, but what about the newer series of Battlestar Galactica? Because I watched it too, and I really enjoyed it. What did you find in there that really stood out as enlightening how the world really works?
Battlestar Galactica, to me, is very Shakespearean. I'm a huge Shakespeare fan. I've read and seen most of Shakespeare performed. And it gets into the big issues of life and death. And it really gets into the issues of governance and how you govern, and the questions of, both military versus civil versus spiritual and religious. And, sort of all those philosophic questions.
Right.
And it also talks, it also shows the importance in leadership of men and women working together, of different generations, working together, of different kinds of points of view being allowed. And I think it's a great description of the challenges that leadership faces, and the importance of great leadership if you're going to make it through difficult and risky times, and how difficult it can be and how much heart and patience it takes.
Yeah,
so,
Adama was a good example of that. Yeah.
Right. He was a great leader. One of my favorite lines in that is when, at the beginning, when Mary McDonnell, who's now president, says something, and Adama says, "I'm running a war here." And she looks at him and she said, "General, we lost the war. Now we have to run away someplace and go have babies." And she's absolutely right. Mm-hmm. And he, in a million years, he would never have seen it. He's like, "Oh, she's right."
Yeah, pretty sophisticated issues come up in that population.
Yeah.
Even mythology, right? How are we going to use this mythology of the gods? And it's funny, you see this kind of trend in a lot of science fiction that's pretty philosophical, like that with Dune, like where you have quite a few people who don't believe in the mythology. They're just pragmatic statesmen, and then you have, certain persons who actually do believe in the mythology, and then generally it turns out the mythology is true in some way. And, I love the part with, the Cylons, and ultimately are they really the enemy? And, we may actually have to work with the Cylons, I thought all that with questions of AI and things like that were fascinating.
Well, I think AI is very, very dangerous, and technology is very, very dangerous. And I think it does a very good job of showing you some of those dangers and making it real. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the things I really liked about it. So. Yeah.
I'm not of the opinion that artificial intelligence can in any way be conscious, given that consciousness is something I think that is a particular feature or characteristic of the human person. And I don't think that we're going to create mechanical human persons. By definition. It's not possible. It's only something that can mimic. But now another one that you mentioned was why Gladiator?
Gladiator, well, first of all, I'm a big Russell Crowe fan, but Gladiator basically is a story of the United States told through the prism of Rome.
Oh, wow.
Because it's describing the extraordinary corruption and what it's like for a non-corrupt leader to try and struggle within the corruption, mm-hmm. and the extent to which the right kind of not corrupt leadership can make a huge difference, which I believe is true. It's really about the mandate of heaven, which is a Chinese expression. Mm-hmm. If a ruler had the mandate of heaven, then everything I'm grossly oversimplifying, but you watch a leader who's got the mandate of heaven and is able to make a difference, just from the power of his character personality and the fact that there are many people looking around. One of the problems we have, Jay, with the corruption in the United States is we've created a federal credit mechanism that will continue to finance, and make corruption economically productive when in fact, it's not. It's doing huge destruction, but the unproductive can continue to get a lower cost of capital and keep on going. And the question is, how do you stop it? And one of the things it's done is it's created a culture which is so wacky, perverted, that you have a tremendous number of people who are saying, I don't care how much money, I don't care how much inconvenience, I want nothing to do with it. It's so, it's so nauseating that I would rather live at the edge of empire than to be wealthy and live in the middle of this. Mm. So you see the dichotomy between the perverted and somebody who's got the mandate of heaven, and you see the power of what that mandate can do and be in the right time and right place. And so I think it does a beautiful job of describing, the loss of power that comes from that perversion, mm-hmm. and the extraordinary power that can come from the mandate of heaven.
Yeah, it seems like we live in an era of a nuclear explosion of knowledge, but not a lot of wisdom. It's almost like wisdom is something of foregone ages. And what I like about this conversation so far is I sense not just knowledge of facts, but actual wisdom from lived experience. And I think that some of the films that you've talked about can highlight that as well. I've always thought that I know it's very much a trope, but films like The Matrix, they really are pretty apt for describing reality, especially from a philosophical perspective, because even certain philosophers like Jean Baudrillard, who writes on simulacrum and he writes on nihilism, and he talks about how one of the dangers of technology is that we fall in love with the synthetic. And the problem with falling in love with the synthetic is that it's not fulfilling. And so we self-destruct because we aren't getting reality. We're getting a constant barrage of what's synthetic. And then that leads to basically giving up. It leads to hating life and hating ourselves because of the lack of fulfillment from everything being synthetic. And it's almost like everything is converting over into being synthetic. Even commerce, even money, I think is becoming something synthetic. I mean, with the scriptures talk about the love of money being the root of evil, but when it's something completely electronic, completely synthetic, ones and zeros, it'll even be even worse, I think, because you don't see banks in Brave New World. You see there's one mention of a bank in Brave New World, and that's it.
So let me give you some of the runner-ups.
Sure.
Some of the runner-ups were The Intelligence, the TV series, the Canadian TV series. I don't know if you've seen it. It's remarkable.
It was excellent about
Yeah.
Because it showed how they had to work with the crooks.
Yeah. Yeah. And it shows you the good guys, bad guys cut across both. It's not about legal or illegal. The Margin Call was one. The TV series La Femme Nikita.
Yes.
The Matrix. Eyes Wide Shut. Kubrick. Kubrick is fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
Soylent Green. Have you ever seen that one?
Oh, yeah. I've seen all the 70s sci-fi, especially Charlton Heston films. From my cold, dead hands.
A very British coup. The International and the Bourne Trilogy.
Yes.
And Longitude. Longitude. Yeah, Longitude.
Yeah, I thought...
So, and John... Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask you, I wrote on the International back when it came out or a couple of years after, and it was right when we started seeing all these stories of banker deaths. So I thought it was very interesting that 2007 or 8, Tom Tykwer did this film about banker deaths. Right.
I was so lucky because I got thrown out, I got spat out before they were killing everybody, so... Although it's kind of a miracle I'm alive because I had some very close experiences. But,
oh, man.
Yeah, it's dangerous. It's dangerous. So you want the documentaries or we just stick with the movies?
Well, hold on. We're going to go to a break and then we'll be back for the final segment with Catherine Austin Fitts. Her site is Solari.com and you're listening to Esoteric Hollywood with Jay. On Esoteric Hollywood, we're talking films that Catherine Austin Fitts finds applicable, appropriate, and enlightening. We were talking about The Matrix and Margin Call and The International, which I thought was really good. Seemed to really tie in with the BCCI scandal. If you've, I know you're familiar.
Well, I was involved. I was involved in the BCCI.
Oh, wow. Okay. Now, here's this thing I read about, in like 5 books, and here I'm talking to somebody who tell us about that.
Well, what happened was they took, the U.S. subsidiary, the Clark Gifford and Wonder Woman husband, they took that entity and the district attorney of New York had Harry Albright become the trustee for it. And so he needed some ringers on the board and he asked me to join the board. So I agreed I would be on the board of the First American Bank. And so we're part of the cleanup team. And Harry has this law firm, Washington law firm. I was living in McLean at the time, bring out all the documents. So this Brink truck comes up to down the driveway and I get like a couple thousand pages of documents. I'm a speed reader, so I read them all the weekend and it was so obvious, Jay, when you put them down, you're just like, wait a minute. The White House, all the agencies, everybody was in on this scam. This was like approved from the highest level.
Wow.
Oh God. I mean, no, it was unbelievable. But anyway, so, but on the International, I just have to tell you one story. In 2000, I went to a friend of mine who was doing investigative research for the FBI, who were doing financial fraud. She got sick and couldn't go to they had asked her to go to a conference in Miami on money laundering. So she said, you want to take my place? I said, sure, a couple of days at the Fontainebleau in Miami, who wouldn't want to do this? Mm-hmm. So I go down and I go into this whole new world for me of people who deal with money laundering regulation. It was a fascinating experience. But one of the things that happened is I heard in a speech, the question I asked, we had an official from Treasury there, and I said, who is in charge of enforcing money laundering for rules for the federal credit, including the mortgage credit? And she said, not only do I not know the answer to your question, I don't understand enough about your question to even understand your question. So I thought, well, this is very bad. If the person from Treasury who's in charge of compliance doesn't know who's supposed to, make sure money laundering isn't happening with federal mortgage credit, that's a big problem. So there was a software vendor fair, and I went in, and they have all these CDs you can buy with all the money laundering regulations from all the different laws across the government. So I said, look, can you just do a search and find out who is supposed to stop money laundering in mortgage financing with the federal credit in the United States? So we do all these searches, and he comes up and he says, I have it. It's the Assistant Secretary of Housing. And my mouth dropped wide open because I had been the Assistant Secretary of Housing, and not once did I know that that was my responsibility. And if Treasury's not doing it, and if the Assistant Secretary doesn't even know they're supposed to do it, then guess what? It ain't happening.
Yeah, right. Wow.
So the International is a very good, primer on the financial system. And one of the things I love is how everybody thinks this bank's really going to go down, and it just, it's like a zombie. It just pops back up. They just reconfigure, bring in some new management team.
Yeah. I liked how it was tied into, and this is something you mentioned in your talks, is the connection between military-industrial complex, Lockheed, CIA,
right,
and banks, and that's what you see in that with these French defense companies that are selling to Middle Easterns, and they're tied into this corrupt bank.
Right.
Well, okay,
right. Does a great job.
You mentioned some documentaries. What are some documentaries?
Okay, so John and I came back and did documentaries. So I'll tell you mine. My number one was Sir James Goldsmith, 1994 interview with Charlie Rose. If you want to understand the global economy, this is the single best video you can watch.
Okay.
Sir James Goldsmith came to the United States and tried to stop the passage of the WTO and said the rebalancing the global economy to proceed this way is insane. This is what's going to happen. And it very much gets into the idea of rounding, 3 billion small farmers go down and get rounded up to live in the cities. So he goes very much into things you would be interested in. Another one, speaking of tax-exempt foundations, is Edward Griffin's interview of Norman Dodd on tax-exempt foundations.
Oh, yeah, that one's a classic.
Have you ever seen that?
Yeah.
Oh, unbelievable.
Right.
Okay, then runner-up, I'm just mentioning the runner-up because we've talked about them as Clifford Carnicom's aerosol crimes on the spraying, and then Phoenix, the Phoenix Lights.
Oh, okay.
Was one of, yeah.
There's an Italian documentary on aerosol spraying. Have you seen that? Chemtrails, The Secret War. That's actually really, it's very well done and very good. They cite, cite quite a few papers on it.
We did this before Fat, Sick, and Nearly Dead, but that's one of my favorites, so I should mention that.
Okay.
Bertram Verhaeghe's food series. Bertram Verhaeghe is a documentary maker from Munich who's done a series on GMO that is absolutely incredible. He never does one thing. He'll do a series, and he did them on sort of both positive and negative. Like he did a couple on GMO and what's going on. Then he did one on Percy Schmeiser and some of the permaculturalists. So it's a series of about 5 or 6. And one of them is on how they're really, they target and destroy the scientists who try and warn people about the GMOs. Then another is the rise and fall of a scientific genius, the forgotten story of Royal Rife, which is really remarkable. Have you seen that?
No, I have not.
It's free on the internet and very, very good. Then another is, believe it or not, Sugar the Bitter Truth, which is a speech that Dr. Robert Lustig gave to a group of students at the University of San Francisco where he teaches and practices that became a complete hit on the internet and just went global. And we had him on the Sugar the Bitter Truth, and he's a remarkable guy. And it was amazing. I got him on the Solari Report, and then 6 months later, he was on 60 Minutes. And one of the subscribers wrote in and says, it's remarkable how many people, on the Solari Report within 3 to 6 months end up on 60 Minutes. Anyway.
You have me on the Solari Report.
And there you go. So, Hot Coffee is another one. Do you know Hot Coffee?
I do not.
Remarkable documentary about tort reform, and it starts off with the lawsuit about the woman who sued McDonald's because the coffee was too hot.
Oh, this thing that you hear from the 80s, that's actually true?
Yeah, no, it's true.
I always wondered if that was true.
So the next one is Adam Curtis's The Century of Self.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic for sure. Yeah.
Very, very amazing. Then another one I chose was The Endurance.
I'm writing these down. What's that?
It's The Endurance is a film on the expedition by Sir Ernest Shackelford to Antarctica.
Oh, okay.
And it was an expedition that went wrong. Everything went wrong, but he was able to lead his men out and get them saved. And it's a story of miracles. It's quite amazing. And he was an amazing man. It's a story of succeeding, against the odds and the power of discipline and extraordinary, sort of, planning and teamwork. It's really a leadership. I'm big on leadership stories.
Gotcha.
And but they were able to save a lot of the photographs and brought them back. And it's just a remarkable story and very, very well done. Then What the Bleep Do We Know?
Yes.
Of course, And Long Way Round. Have you ever seen Long Way Round?
I have not.
Oh, God. This is Charlie McEwen and Ewan McGregor and Charlie, what's his name? Charlie. Anyway, so, they're pals. So here you've got these two sort of actors, movie stars, and they decide to ride motorcycles around the world. And I had an intern working for me at Solari who tried to interest me. It's like 8 hours of watching these two guys ride their motorcycles around the world. I thought, why would I want to watch this? You got to be crazy. Well, so Saturday morning I was having breakfast and I thought, well, I'll just look at the first one. 8 hours later, I'm just finishing it. I couldn't stop watching it. It's fabulous. You really feel, we have a saying at Solari about wanting to live a free and inspired life. Mm-hmm. And you travel around the world with these guys, and it's just, you feel like you're having a free and inspired life. It's very, it's very freeing.
Speaking of Ewan McGregor and your line of business, have you ever heard of this older film? I think it's 2001 or 2, Rogue Trader.
Oh yes, it's the story of how they stuck everything on that poor kid in Singapore.
Yep.
Right.
That was a good movie. Yeah.
Well, it's really funny because you'll see these situations where they have a mess like that, and suddenly, the bell goes off and everybody say, okay, take all your losses, we'll throw it all in and, pin it on the donkey. It's like pin the tail on the donkey.
Right.
So some guys, perpetuated a fraud and lost a whole bunch of money, and so suddenly he wakes up and, what happened? It's, instead of it being 20 million, it's like 250 million,
Exactly.
And he's to blame for, it's pretty, it's a pretty interesting story and one that's sort of connected to my old firm and partners.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I think that, and if I recall, it was years ago when I watched it, but what he was involved in the film was tied into, older London banking houses, if I recall.
Right. Anyway, so those were, there are a few more, but those were the documentaries we chose. And I also have a great one I'll send to you, Jay, on, I did let's go to the movies on the top 20 food documentaries, because a lot of our subscribers like great food documentaries to sort of help them, once they realize, I can't trust the food supply. The next question is, what do I do? And so then I give them this list of the top 20 food documentaries. They start plowing through. And I should mention, because I just posted a review of the Truth in Cancer, Ty Bollinger's new series. And I've only watched the first 3, but I think it's very well done. And I gave it a big Solari Gold star on the website. So
awesome. Now tell us real quick so everybody can sign up at Solari.com, right?
Yeah, so if you just want to sign up for the update list, just give us your email address and we send out a weekly update to tell you what's up. Part of our content is free. Some is the subscriber only. And if you're interested in getting the subscriber only content, just sign up for a subscription. You can subscribe for monthly, 6 months, or a year. And we have a special now where you can get our wrap ups. One of the things we do, Jay, that is really a very important thing at the Solari Report is we do 3 quarterly wrap ups and an annual wrap up. And it's designed so that if you're a very busy person and you can pay no attention to the news, but you read those 4 wrap-ups every year, you will have a better handle of knowing what's going on than people who read the news.
Oh, wow. Excellent. All right. Thank you. This has been Esoteric Hollywood with Catherine Austin Fitts. Her site was Solari.com. My site is jaysanalysis.com.